After the doctor told my 75-year-old husband he was ill, he blamed me and demanded a divorce, shouting, "You are the sickness in this family." Our two sons applauded him. I silently packed a bag, but I left a note on the table that sent all three of them into a panic the next day, searching for me all over the city. Before I begin, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and write in the comments which country you're listening from. It would be a great pleasure to know. Enjoy the story. The doctor's voice was a steady, monotonous drone, like a power transformer. The words he spoke, chronic insufficiency, prognosis, irreversible changes, flew past my consciousness without lingering. I stared at the faded poster on the wall depicting a human heart in cross-section. It was so bright, almost cartoonish, with its blue and red vessels, and had nothing in common with the gray, exhausted muscle now being discussed. My husband, Arthur, sat beside me, hunched over the desk. His face, usually ruddy with self-satisfaction and a good appetite, had turned ashen. He wasn't looking at the doctor. He was looking at me, and in his gaze, I already saw what had been festering in him for all 50 years of our marriage. A dull, stubborn accusation. As if I had been poisoning his tea, not he himself who had indulged in rich food, brandy, and cigars for decades, ignoring all my pleas to take care of himself. We drove home in a deafening silence. Arthur breathed heavily, listening to every beat in his chest as if expecting betrayal from his own body. I looked out the window at the familiar streets of our Napa Valley town, which suddenly seemed alien. There was the bakery where I used to run for warm bread for breakfast. There was the park where our sons, Julian and Miles, once chased pigeons. My whole life was in these streets, in this apartment, in this silence next to this man. A life dedicated to making sure everything was good for them, that the house was a place of plenty, the shirts were ironed, and dinner was always a 3-course meal. As soon as we stepped over the threshold of our sprawling vineyard home, the stuffy air hit me. It smelled of dust, of old resentment, and of the herbal remedies Arthur had started taking a week ago. Our sons were already there. Julian, the elder at 48, was pacing in the hallway with the perpetually worried face of a manager whose sales plan is failing. Miles, the younger, a 45-year-old genius with perpetually failing startups, was sprawled in an armchair, scrolling through something on his phone. They were waiting for the verdict. Arthur, without taking off his coat, walked into the living room. He stopped in the middle of the room, massive, slumped, and surveyed everyone with a heavy gaze. "Well, Dad?" Julian asked nervously. Arthur slowly turned his head towards me. His face was suffused with a familiar, dangerous purple. I knew that color. It appeared when the soup wasn't hot enough, when I misplaced his newspaper, when I dared to have my own opinion. "Her," he exhaled, pointing a finger at me. "It's all her." The sons exchanged glances. "Dad, what are you talking about? What did the doctor say?" There was a hint of impatience in Miles's voice. "He said I'm sick," Arthur roared, and the roar seemed to shake the old crystal in the sideboard. "He said my heart is worn out. And who wore it out all these years? Who nagged me every day? Who created an unbearable atmosphere in this house? You." He took a step towards me. "You are the sickness in this family. You are the poison that has been slowly killing me. A divorce. I demand a divorce. I will not spend the rest of my days next to this woman." I stood and looked at him. There was a ringing in my ears, but not from his shouting. I had expected something like this. Maybe not so directly, not so grotesquely, but I knew I would be blamed. It had always been this way. But then, something happened that I could not have foreseen. In the silence that hung after his roar, a sound was heard. A sharp, dry single clap. It was Julian. He was applauding. And after a second's hesitation, Miles joined in. Their applause was not loud, but somehow businesslike, coordinated. As if they weren't applauding their father, but approving a successfully concluded deal. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Not with a crash, not with a shatter like broken dishes. No. I felt a quiet, cold click, as if an old rusted mechanism that had held me in one place for 50 years had finally broken. My chest became empty and very, very cold. All the pain, all the resentments, all the humiliations I had accumulated inside me turned to ice. I silently turned and went to the bedroom. The three of them, my husband and my sons, watched me go. I felt their gazes on my back, full of triumph and contempt. I heard Miles chuckle. "It's about time, Dad. The right decision." I took an old, worn-out faux leather suitcase from the top of the closet, the very one I had come to this city with 72 years ago to attend college. I opened the closet. What to take? You can't pack a life into one suitcase. I took 2 changes of underwear, an old but favorite woolen cardigan that I had knitted myself, a toothbrush, soap. From the shelf, I took a volume of poetry and a photograph of my parents. Nothing more. Everything else in this house belonged to them, to their world, to their healthy family from which I had been exiled. They stood in the bedroom doorway watching me with smirks. They didn't interfere. They were enjoying my defeat, my quiet, pathetic, as it seemed to them, flight. I walked past them without looking up. In the hallway, I stopped at the large dining table, covered with a tablecloth I had embroidered during long winter evenings. I took my apartment key from my robe pocket, old brass, worn smooth by time, and placed it in the most prominent place. Then I took a notepad and a pen from the windowsill. On a clean sheet, I wrote just a few words. My handwriting, usually calligraphic, was surprisingly firm. I left the note next to the key, took the suitcase, which seemed very light, and without looking back, opened the front door. I didn't look at their faces. I didn't want to remember their triumph. I just stepped over the threshold and quietly closed the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded like a period at the end of a very long, very tedious sentence. I knew what would happen next. I could almost hear it through the thick door. Arthur would let out a sigh of relief. Julian would walk over to the table, lazily pick up my note. He would read it aloud, drawing out the words with a mocking intonation. "The vineyard is yours. I've only taken what belongs to me." And they would laugh loudly, relievedly. Miles would probably go to the kitchen, take his father's cognac from the bar, and pour it into glasses. They would drink to freedom, to their deliverance, to the fact that the old sick burden had left on her own, leaving them everything: the apartment, the car, the savings, and most importantly, their beloved vineyard, Arthur's pride and joy. They were sure that I had left with a few pathetic belongings, old photographs, and my resentment. They didn't understand one thing. My note was not an admission of defeat. It was a declaration of war. A war they didn't even know had begun. I descended the stairs, and each of my steps echoed in the empty entrance. The suitcase wasn't heavy, but I carried it as if it held the weight of my 72 years. The cold evening air hit my face, making me squint for a moment. I didn't call a taxi. Where was I in a hurry to go? I trudged to the bus stop, moving in the stream of passers-by who were rushing about their business, to their warm homes, to their families. No one paid any attention to me, just another elderly woman with a bag. On the half-empty bus, I sat by the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Outside the window, the city lights floated by, reflecting in my eyes, but I didn't see them. I thought about how, for the first time in 50 years, I was going somewhere without warning Arthur, without leaving him dinner on the stove, without checking if he had taken his pills. This thought brought neither relief nor guilt. It was just a fact, like the coming of evening. My granddaughter Sophie's apartment was in an ordinary panel house on the outskirts. The entrance smelled of cats and sour cabbage. I went up to the 4th floor, and my heart, not sick like Arthur's but just tired, began to beat faster. I rang the bell. The door opened almost instantly. Sophie, my 22-year-old girl, a student, a bright girl. She looked at me, at my suitcase, at my face, and didn't ask a single question. "No. Grandma, what happened?" Her eyes, large and serious, understood everything. She silently took the suitcase from my hand, set it aside, then took me by the hand and led me into her tiny, cluttered with books, but surprisingly warm and cozy apartment. She sat me in the only armchair, old with worn armrests, covered my shoulders with a soft blanket, went to the kitchen, and a couple of minutes later returned with a cup of tea, strong, very sweet, exactly the kind I used to drink in my youth. She placed the cup on my lap and sat on the floor at my feet, resting her head on my knees as she did in childhood. And I cried. Silently, without sobs. The tears just streamed down my cheeks, dripping onto the blanket, onto her light hair. I was crying not from resentment. I was crying because for the first time in many, many years, someone was taking care of me. Just like that, without reproaches, without conditions, without expecting anything in return. All these simple actions to seat, to cover, to give tea were my repertoire, my lifelong duty. I had performed them for my husband, for my sons, for everyone. And now they were being done for me. And in this simple, silent care of my granddaughter, there was more love and recognition than in all the words I had heard in recent decades. I felt not exiled but saved. Seen. Finally seen. And at that time in our apartment which I had just left, there was merriment. The three men were joined by Amelia, Julian's wife. She had arrived as soon as her son called her with the good news. On the table was a bottle of Armenian cognac, sliced sausage and cheese. "Well, to freedom," Arthur proclaimed, raising his glass. His face had regained its usual self-satisfied flush. The diagnosis was temporarily forgotten. "Finally, this house will breathe freely." "It's about time, Dad," Julian chimed in. She always had a sour face. "Whatever you do, it's not right." And the constant nagging. "Arthur, don't eat fatty foods. Arthur, don't smoke." She was making an invalid out of me long before any doctors, my husband boasted. "And now we can deal with the vineyard properly," Amelia inserted in her thin, calculating voice. "Julian, we need to find a good realtor right away to appraise the land. The location is prime. We'll sell it and solve all of Father's problems at once." Miles gave a crooked smile. "The main thing is that Mom doesn't change her mind and come back tomorrow morning to repent." "Where is she going to come back to?" Julian snorted. "With nothing. She wrote that she only took what belongs to her." "What belongs to her?" "A couple of dresses and a pot. She'll wander around and come crawling back. Only we won't let her in." They laughed, clinked glasses, made plans. They were dividing the skin of an unkilled bear, not even suspecting that the bear had already gone to another den. The next morning, Julian woke up first with the businesslike air. His head was pounding from yesterday's drinking, but the anticipation of a big deal invigorated him better than any coffee. "I'm going to the vineyard," he said to his father, who was drinking tea sullenly in the kitchen. "I called a realtor I know. He's ready to come in an hour to look at the property. We have to do everything quickly." He confidently took a set of keys from the hook in the hallway. The familiar car logo keychain fit comfortably in his palm. He went outside, clicked the alarm button. In response, silence. Julian frowned, walked over to the parking spot where they always left the car. The spot was empty. The first thought was annoyance. Someone took it again. But after walking around the yard, he realized the car was gone. At all. A cold, unpleasant thought crept into his head. Could it be her? No, that's crazy. How could she? He returned to the apartment. His face no longer expressed businesslike confidence. "The car is gone," he said into the void. Arthur and Miles, who had come out of his room, stared at him. "What do you mean gone?" Arthur croaked. "Stolen." Julian grabbed the phone and dialed 911. After a few minutes of waiting and explaining, he haltingly told the operator about the disappearance. "Yes, a silver sedan." He gave the number. "Yes, Arthur Chandler. That is, we use it together." He fell silent, listening to the answer. His face slowly elongated. How was it towed? At whose request? He listened again, and the color drained from his cheeks. He turned as pale as his father had in the doctor's office yesterday. "I don't understand," he muttered into the phone. "But the car is ours, we bought it." He froze, listening to the even, indifferent voice on the other end. Then he slowly lowered the phone. "What? What is it?" Miles and Arthur asked in one voice. Julian looked at them with unseeing eyes. "It was towed last night. At the request of the owner, due to unauthorized use." "What owner?" "I'm the owner." Arthur roared, jumping up from his chair. No, Julian said quietly. The dispatcher said that according to the Central DMV registry, the sole registered owner of this vehicle for the past 15 years has been Catherine Chandler. A ringing silence hung in the room. A cold, sticky, viscous horror began to fill the space. The documents. Miles suddenly remembered. Where are the documents for the car? The registration, the title? They were always in the dresser drawer. He rushed to the old dresser in the hallway, yanked open the top drawer, the very one where all the important papers had been kept for decades. He began to frantically rummage through old receipts, warranty cards, manuals for household appliances. He was dumping the contents onto the floor. His movements became more and more sharp, panicked. Finally, he pulled the drawer out completely and shook the rest onto the carpet. It was empty. That is, not completely. There were old papers, but the folder with the car documents was not there. Catherine Chandler had taken them with her. I stood by the window in Sophie's apartment and looked down at the bustling morning city. I didn't see the cars or the people. I only saw the old, swollen from dampness dresser drawer and the scattered papers. I could almost physically feel Miles's panic, his frantic, angry movements. I knew that drawer better than he did. I knew every receipt, every old instruction, and I knew that the folder with the car documents was no longer there. I had taken it yesterday before I left. It was the last thing I did before writing the note. I just opened the drawer, took the blue plastic folder, and put it at the bottom of my suitcase. No one noticed. For them, they were always just papers, a boring routine that I took care of. I can imagine what was going on in their heads. Not just confusion, fear. The first real animal fear. The car was not just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of their status, their freedom, their superiority. And this symbol had disappeared, dissolved. And I had taken it, the quiet, inconspicuous Catherine, whom they had written off. I knew their next step as well as I knew that morning follows night. The vineyard. Their sanctuary, their main asset. Their hope for salvation. I can almost hear Julian stammering with anger, calling a friend, begging to borrow a car for just a couple of hours. A matter of life and death. I see Arthur breathing heavily, getting dressed. His face has turned earthy again, but now not from illness but from rage. He must have been shouting that he would grind me into dust, that I would regret the day I was born. Miles was probably silent. His brain, accustomed to schemes and projects, was frantically trying to calculate the situation and, for the first time in his life, not finding a solution. The drive to the vineyard is 40 kilometers of suburban highway. Usually it was a pleasant trip. Arthur would drive, his hand resting casually on the steering wheel, anticipating barbecues and relaxing in a hammock. But now I'm sure the air in their friend's old car was thick with hatred and fear. Their bravado from yesterday had evaporated with the first turn of the key, in the ignition of someone else's car. Every kilometer brought them not closer to triumph, but to uncertainty. Here they are, turning off the highway onto our country road. Here's the familiar turn, the pines, and behind them, the high green fence. Their fence, their fortress. They drive up to the gate. Julian gets out of the car. In his hand is a set of keys. He walks up to the gate to insert the familiar heavy key into the lock and freezes. The lock is gone. The old rusty lock that Arthur had been promising to replace for the last 5 years, but never got around to it. In its place, on powerful new hasps that weren't there yesterday, hangs a new shiny industrial barn lock. You can't pick it with a hairpin, you can't knock it off with a stone. And right in the center of the gate, attached to the metal bars with a plastic tie, hangs a file. In it is a white sheet of paper, neatly laminated. In large black letters it says, "Property under 24-hour surveillance by barrier security. Video surveillance is in progress. Security provided at the request of the owner, K. Chandler." I can imagine Julian's face at that moment, his bewilderment turning into powerless rage. He yanks the gate, it doesn't budge. In desperation, he sticks his key into the keyhole of the new lock. Of course it doesn't fit. It's useless. A piece of metal. Arthur, I know, has tumbled out of the car, breathing heavily. He saw the lock, he saw the sign. His face must have been terrible. He probably started shouting, spewing curses, pounding his fist on the gate. But the gate was silent. It was alien. It no longer belonged to him. She's gone mad. I can almost hear his hoarse cry. That old witch has lost her mind. It's okay, we'll hire the best lawyer. We'll sue her. We'll prove she's incompetent. She'll be on her knees, begging for forgiveness. Money. That's their last argument. Their God and their weapon. We need money, Julian says, getting back in the car. Everything we have. We'll withdraw it all from the account right now and go to a lawyer. Yes, of course. The bank account. Their joint piggy bank, their confidence in the future. Arthur's pension went there. For decades I had put everything I could save there. Every penny. I denied myself a new coat to buy them new tires for the car. I wore the same boots for the 5th season so they could go on vacation. All these years I was the treasurer, the guardian of their well-being. They would only lazily ask from time to time, "Well, Mom, how much do we have in there?" And upon hearing the sum, they would nod with satisfaction. While they were racing back to the city in a rage, Sophie and I were drinking coffee in her small kitchen. In the morning, while the city was just waking up, she and I were already on our feet. We had a leisurely breakfast. I told her everything, not complaining but simply stating the facts. She listened in silence, only squeezing my hand tighter. Then we got dressed and went out. The bank branch was quiet and cool. They knew me here. I came here every month to pay the bills. A sweet teller, a young girl named Sveta, smiled at me. "Catherine, hello." The usual. "Hello, Sveta." No, something different today. We were escorted to a private office to see the manager. A pleasant, full-bodied woman in a strict suit. She listened to me attentively. I explained that I wanted to transfer all the funds from our joint account with my husband to a new one, opened only in my name. She asked for my passport and the account opening agreement. I had brought everything with me in that same blue folder. She studied the documents for several minutes. Then she looked up at me. "Yes, Catherine. You are the primary account holder. Your signature is first. You have the full right to conduct any operations, including the complete withdrawal of funds and the closure of the account, without the consent of the second depositor. This is a standard clause in contracts of this type. Are you sure of your decision?" I looked at Sophie. She nodded encouragingly. "Absolutely sure," I said firmly. The procedure took no more than 20 minutes. The printing of a bank check, signatures, the opening of a new account. It was all ridiculously simple. The paper routine, the very thing my husband and sons despise so much. And now, a couple of hours later, I imagine the three of them bursting into the same bank branch. Flushed, angry, but full of determination. Arthur is probably walking in front, his chest puffed out to show who's boss. They approach the counter to the same Sveta. "We need to withdraw all the money from the account of Arthur Chandler," Julian says, holding out his father's passport. Sveta looks at them with undisguised pity. She types something on the keyboard. Her face doesn't change. "One moment, I'll check." She looks at the screen, then at them. "Yes, I see the account, but I'm afraid there's almost nothing there." "What do you mean, nothing?" Arthur roars so that the people in line turn around. "All our life savings should be there." "Check again." Sveta sighs and turns the monitor towards them. "Here, see for yourselves. The account balance is $14. 14.00. Not the millions they had already mentally divided. 14.00 for a pack of cheap dumplings and a bottle of vodka. Where did the money go?" Miles whispers, his face turning white as paper. "This morning, it was transferred at the direction of the primary account holder," Sveta replies in a flat, rehearsed voice. "The entire amount was withdrawn via a bank check and deposited into another account. The operation was conducted completely legally. Your wife, Catherine Chandler, had every right to do so. The foundation of their world, built on my savings, on my patience, on my life, had collapsed in one morning. And it wasn't a cruel fate, not enemies, not a global crisis that did it. It was me, the old sick burden they had so joyfully gotten rid of last night. I didn't hear them leave the bank, didn't see their deathly pale faces, but I knew it as clearly as if I were standing right there. I knew the silence that follows a catastrophe, the silence in which a world collapses. There was silence in my soul too, but it was not the silence of ruins. It was the silence of an empty, cleaned house that was just waiting to be put in order. The money was safe, the vineyard was under lock and key, but there was no peace. A splinter had been lodged inside me for many years, a feeling I had sensed but never acknowledged, a vague but constant feeling that something was wrong, that something was leaking, seeping through my fingers like water into sand. I, a librarian with 40 years of experience, was used to order in catalogs and in life. But there was no order in our finances. Arthur always brushed off my questions. Inflation, woman. Don't you read the papers? I've invested a little. Let the money work. His explanations were vague, and I, out of habit of trusting, out of habit of not meddling in men's affairs, would retreat. Now it was time to find out the truth. Sophie and I were sitting in the kitchen. Seeing my state, she had brought her laptop, old, a little scratched. "Grandma," she said quietly, "if something doesn't add up, you can almost always find it. People leave traces, especially on the internet." I shook my head. "What internet, Sophie? Your grandfather despised computers. He said they were toys for idlers." "An email address?" she insisted gently. "He must have had one for government services, for registering somewhere." And then I remembered. About 10 years ago, when everyone was required to register on the government portal, I had helped him create that email account myself. He had grumbled for a long time then, got frustrated, pounded on the keys, and then gave up and said, "You do it, since you need it." I had created it. I remembered the password. He had come up with it himself, proud of his ingenuity. Victor 75. The year of his birth and the word he believed described his whole essence. Sophie opened the login page. I gave her the address and the password. My fingers trembled slightly as I dictated. Sophie pressed enter. The inbox loaded. Hundreds of emails, advertisements, notifications from government services, congratulations from some distant relatives. I started to look through them and at first found nothing suspicious. But then Sophie noticed a folder, a separate folder, created manually. It was simply called Business. My heart stopped for a moment. The first thought, a shameful, womanly one. A mistress. That I would find correspondence with another woman. It would have been painful. But as it turned out, the truth was much worse. Sophie clicked on the folder. Inside were not love letters. There were files, scans of documents, an agreement to establish a limited liability company, Riverwood Artisans. Date of registration, 4 years ago. General Director and sole founder, Arthur Chandler. Riverwood Artisans. I looked at these words and understood nothing. What LLC? What workshop? Arthur had worked at the factory his whole life, and after retirement, he only dealt with the vineyard and watching television. We started opening the emails in that folder. They were sorted by year. We started from the very beginning. The first emails were full of optimism. Correspondence with equipment suppliers, an order for a small woodworking machine, a lease agreement for a tiny space on the outskirts of an industrial zone. I read, and a picture formed in my mind. My husband, in secret from me, had decided to fulfill some old dream of his, to prove to everyone, and first and foremost to himself, that he was still good for something, that he was not just a pensioner but a businessman. A belated, bitter pity stirred in my chest. Why hadn't he told me? Did he really think I wouldn't support him? But the further we read, the less room there was for pity. The emails from the following year changed their tone. The first alarming notes appeared. "Mr. Chandler, we remind you of your debt for the batch of oak boards. Please pay the rent for the last 2 months." The emails from last year were already openly angry. "Dear Mr. Chandler, if payment is not received by the end of the week, we will be forced to stop shipping materials and sue you. We demand the immediate return of the loan funds taken against the equipment as collateral." And through them Arthur's replies. Pathetic, full of a false, wounded dignity. He wrote about temporary difficulties, About delays from customers. He promised. He swore that everything would be paid next week. I read and felt an icy emptiness fill me from the inside. Now I understood where the money was going. All these years he wasn't investing. He was sinking. He was sinking our joint, my savings, into this black hole of his pride. He was throwing them into the furnace of his failed business, just so he wouldn't have to admit his incompetence. He preferred to lie to me, to steal from his own family, just to save face in front of himself. All his illness, all his anger at me, it was the fear of exposure. He was angry not at the cholesterol, but at the fact that his illness was preventing him from continuing to pretend that he was in control. But the most terrible blow was yet to come. Almost at the very top of the list was a recent correspondence, from a week ago, between Julian and Miles. The subject of the letter. Regarding father. Sophie opened it. I leaned closer to the screen. It wasn't one email but a whole chain. The first was from Miles. Julian, this is the end. I got a call today from the lumber company. They're filing a lawsuit next week. This shed of his with the planks will drag us all to the bottom. He has more debts than our entire apartment is worth. What are we going to do? Julian's reply came an hour later. It was cold and businesslike. Calm down, panic won't help. The plan is this. We need to sell the vineyard urgently. It's not in his name, which is good. The money from the sale will go to pay off the most pressing debts. We need to deal with father. His heart is our, however cynical it sounds, chance. With such a diagnosis, we can get him into a state-run home for veterans. We'll say he needs round-the-clock care that we can't provide. I closed my eyes. A nursing home. They were going to put their own father in an institution like a useless thing. But the last letter from Miles made my blood run cold. And what about her? She won't let us sell the vineyard. She'll cling to her flower beds. Julian's reply was short, and it explained everything that had happened yesterday. Every word, every gesture, every applause. We'll make her leave on her own. Father is already on edge because of his heart. We'll just direct his anger in the right direction. She will become the cause of all his troubles. He will kick her out himself. We will support him, humiliate her so that she runs away herself. No one will say a word. And we will look like unfortunate children trying to save a sick father from a tyrant wife. The main thing is to remove her from the equation. Quietly and quickly. I leaned back in my chair. The air ran out. It wasn't spontaneous cruelty, not a flash of anger. It was a plan. A cold, calculated, cynical plan. They wanted to get rid of both of us. Of me, to take the last of what we had. Of him, so as not to carry his debts and his infirmity. His scream, their applause, it was all a performance. A performance directed by my own sons. My husband's betrayal was bitter. But my children's betrayal? I had no name for that feeling. It wasn't pain. It was the death of something inside of what made me a mother. I sat looking at the laptop screen, but I wasn't seeing the letters. I was seeing faces. Julian's face, businesslike and focused as he wrote those lines. Miles's face, twisted in a familiar smirk. Arthur's face, contorted with a rage that was not his own, but just a tool in the hands of his children. Sophie silently closed the laptop lid. The sound of the click seemed deafeningly loud in the ensuing silence. She just came up and hugged me. And in that hug I drew strength not for revenge but to endure. I knew they would come. Their world had collapsed, and they would instinctively rush to the one they considered the cause of this collapse. They couldn't do otherwise. Narcissism and cowardice always look for someone else to blame. Sooner or later they would find out where I was. They had Amelia, her friends, mutual acquaintances. Our city is not that big. The only question was when they would appear. They appeared in the evening. Sophie and I were drinking tea when there was an insistent, furious ring at the door. Not just a ring, a pounding with a fist. Sophie started and looked at me. I slowly put down my cup. Inside me there was no fear, only a cold, ringing calm. I nodded to her. Go open it. On the threshold stood all three of them, Julian and Miles in front. Their faces were pale but contorted with rage. Behind them, like a shadow, hid Arthur. He looked lost and pathetic, like a big sick child brought along by his older brothers. "So there you are," Julian hissed, pushing Sophie aside and bursting into the tiny hallway. Miles followed him. They brought with them the smell of the street, of anger, and of expensive but cheap-smelling cologne. They filled the entire space of the small apartment. Their massive figures seemed out of place among Sophie's books and sketches. "What are you doing?" Miles began, his voice breaking into a shriek. "Have you completely lost your mind? Decided to ruin us?" I silently looked at them. I was sitting in the same old armchair, covered with the same blanket. I didn't get up. "Stop this circus immediately," Julian chimed in, pointing a finger at me, just like his father yesterday. "You're coming with us to the notary tomorrow and signing everything back. The car, the vineyard, the account, everything." They were trying to speak authoritatively, threateningly, but I could hear the panic in their voices. It wasn't the command of masters of life. It was the cry of drowning men. "You, mother, don't seem to understand," Miles sneered. He took a step closer to me. "We can have you declared incompetent. Father has a bad heart. You've upset him, caused this scandal. This is called abuse of trust. Do you want to go to jail in your old age? You've completely lost it, mother. You're just confused." He said this with such mockery, with such disgusting superiority. And at that moment, something happened that they didn't expect. Sophie, my quiet, fragile girl, took a step forward. She stood between me and my sons. In her hand she held her phone, the camera lens pointed at them. The small red recording light glowed like a target. "Please repeat that, Uncle Miles." Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "That she's lost it and is incompetent. This is for the record." Miles faltered. He stared at the phone, then at Sophie, then at me. The mask of confidence cracked. Julian also fell silent, his face contorted. They were not prepared for this. They were used to no one daring to object to them. And then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke quietly, almost indifferently, looking over the heads of my sons. I looked directly into the eyes of Arthur, who had shrunk by the door, trying to become invisible. "There will be no more signatures." My voice sounded surprisingly firm in the silence. "I know about Riverwood artisans," I said, pausing after each word, driving them in like nails. "I know about the debts, about the suppliers, about the creditors." I saw their faces change. Rage gave way to bewilderment and then to pure animal terror. Miles's eyes widened. Julian opened his mouth but couldn't utter a sound. They froze like statues. "I know what you were going to do with him." I nodded towards the petrified Arthur. "After you sold my vineyard." I let these words hang in the air, let them soak into the walls of this small room. I saw understanding dawn in Arthur's eyes, not only of my words. He finally understood the role his beloved sons had assigned him in this performance. The role of a sacrificial lamb. Their masks of righteous anger crumbled to dust. Before me stood not formidable men, but frightened, caught in the act boys. The fear of exposure, the fear of public shame was more terrible for them than any poverty. "You all planned my future so diligently." I surveyed them all with a cold gaze. "Now I will deal with my own future." I slowly rose from the chair, set aside the blanket. I approached them. They instinctively backed away, as if from a fire. I walked past them, past my sons, and stopped in front of my husband, in front of the man to whom I had given 50 years of my life. He looked at me. In his eyes was fear, a plea, shame, a whole gamut of feelings I had never seen in him before. He wanted to say something, but his lips wouldn't obey him. I silently looked at my left hand. On my ring finger, grown into the skin, was a simple gold ring. It had been on me since I was 22. It had witnessed everything. Rare joys and endless humiliations. I had never taken it off. Slowly, with an effort, I pulled it off my finger. The skin underneath was white and defenseless. I held out my hand and placed the ring on the small table in the hallway, next to Sophie's keys. It clinked quietly. This sound was louder than any scream. I didn't put the ring in his hand. I just left it on the table like a useless thing. And then I turned and walked back to my chair. I didn't look at them. I just turned away. I sat down and picked up my cold cup of tea. The performance was over. The curtain. And now they were left on the stage, blinded by the light of truth, not knowing what to do next. All their power, all their strength was in their secret. And I had just voiced that secret. And with that, I had taken their last weapon from them. I looked at the pattern on my old cup. They didn't leave right away. At first, there was silence, heavy, viscous, like river silt. They stood, and I sat with my back to them, and that was more terrible than any eye contact. They didn't know what to say. All their prepared threats, all their accusations had crumbled to dust. Then I heard one of them, I think Julian, curse under his breath. I heard footsteps. They were leaving, bumping into each other in the narrow hallway like blind kittens. The front door slammed. Sophie came up, silently took my wedding ring from the table, and put it in a box. She didn't say anything, but I knew she understood. This gesture was my real divorce, not a legal one, but a human one. Everything that would follow was just a formality. I knew that I had set in motion a mechanism that could not be stopped. Arthur, with his pride, could hide his failures for as long as he wanted. But his creditors were people of a different sort. Their patience had run out long before his heart had given out. My departure and the blocking of the accounts became the last straw for them. They realized that they would not get any money from the old man. And then they went further down the chain, to his heirs. The first blow fell on Julian. He cared more about his reputation than anyone in the family, about his image as a successful manager. He worked in a large trading company in a large office center with glass walls, where everything was in plain sight. It was there, in the middle of the working day, that the owner of the lumber company appeared. He was a short but stocky man with a weathered and angry face. He didn't make an appointment. He just walked past the secretary, opened the door to the sales department where Julian sat, and asked loudly, for the entire open space to hear, "Does Julian Chandler work here?" Julian, as I was later told, turned pale and jumped up. He tried to lead the man into the corridor, muttering something about a misunderstanding, but the man stood his ground. "What misunderstanding?" he boomed, so that everyone in the department stopped typing. "Your father, Arthur Chandler, owes me almost $500,000 for lumber. The deliveries were for your family business, Riverwood Artisans. He's been feeding me promises for 6 months, and now his phone doesn't answer. You're his son, you're in on his business. I know. When will I get my money?" The scandal was loud and humiliating. Julian's colleagues, his subordinates, his boss, everyone witnessed this scene. The image of a solid, reliable employee was crumbling before their eyes. It turned out that his respectable family had some dark dealings, a secret business, and huge debts. The news spread through the office and then beyond with the speed of a forest fire. Our city is big, but the world of successful people in it is small. Everyone knows everyone. And the story began to be embellished with details. The story that just yesterday Julian and Miles themselves had been spreading, about a sick mother who had run away from a sick father, died in the face of a new, much more exciting one. A secret business, a failure, debts, a conspiracy of sons who were trying to sell the vineyard to pay off the debts and kick both parents out. This was much more interesting. The reputation of the Chandler family, which Arthur and his sons had so carefully built for decades, had crumbled in 2 days. Now they were not just without money, they had become toxic pariahs. At that very moment, when the ground under their feet had turned into quicksand, my lawyer entered the scene. I had found him on the advice of a friend of Sophie's. He was not young, a very calm and solid man named Boris. He listened to my story, studied the documents I brought, and nodded. "It's clear, Catherine. We will act." He didn't call them. He sent them an official letter. To all 3 of them, to the registration address in my former apartment. By courier with a return receipt. I can imagine the horror with which they opened that thick white envelope. Inside was an offer. The lawyer laid it out in dry legal language, without emotion or reproach. It was simple and non-negotiable. First, I, Catherine Chandler, refused to file a complaint with law enforcement agencies for conspiracy to commit fraud on a particularly large scale. Boris explained to me that their correspondence was direct proof of intent, and if desired, a criminal case could be opened. Second, in return Arthur, Julian, and Miles Chandler, all three of them, sign a notarized document. In this document they completely and unconditionally renounce any claims, past, present, and future, to all my property. The apartment, the vineyard, the car, and all the funds in my accounts. Third, they officially, within the framework of the same document, assume joint and several liability for all the debts and obligations of Riverwood Artisans, as well as all expenses related to the treatment and maintenance of Arthur Chandler. And last, the deadline for making a decision is 72 hours. In case of refusal or an attempt to dispute the terms, I will immediately file a police report and a lawsuit. I read this document and understood its genius. It was not an act of mercy. It was an ultimatum. I was not demanding anything from them that did not belong to them. I was simply offering them to take what was theirs. Their debts, their responsibility, their problems. I was giving them not a chance for salvation, but the only door out of the burning house that they themselves had set on fire. They were trapped. On the one hand, angry creditors who had already begun to publicly tear them apart. On the other, the threat of a criminal case and complete, final disgrace. On the third, the prospect of long and hopeless litigation with me, for which they had neither the money nor the legal grounds. My offer was the only way for them to contain the fire, to take all the debts upon themselves, to hush up the scandal, and to try to somehow survive. They were forced to accept my terms not by my rightness, not by the voice of conscience. They were forced by fear. The external pressure from those to whom they were indebted became the very catalyst that cemented my victory. They were ready to fight with me, a weak woman, but they were not ready to fight with the whole world, which had suddenly turned its back on them. They had to choose between bad and terrible, and they chose bad. They chose to sign. They signed. All three of them. I was not present. I was represented by Boris. He later told me that they sat in his office in silence, with stone faces, not looking at each other. Arthur was breathing heavily. Julian was nervously tapping a pen on the table. And Miles just stared at one point. They put their signatures quickly without reading. They just wanted it to be over. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of their end. Their alliance, held together by the common goal of getting rid of me and dividing the inheritance, lasted exactly as long as there was a common goal and a common enemy. As soon as the enemy disappeared, and there was nothing to divide but debts, their union fell apart. All the rage, all the malice they had accumulated for me, was now turned on each other. I can imagine them returning to the apartment after signing the papers, to the very apartment that in 30 days would cease to be their home. My lawyer had included a clause in the agreement that they had to vacate it within a month. I was planning to sell it. The first to explode, I'm sure, was Julian. He was always more direct in his anger. He attacked Miles. It was all you and your brilliant ideas. Let's direct his anger. We directed it. Are you happy? We're up to our ears in shit now. I'm going to be eaten alive at work because of this scandal. Miles, who had spent his whole life feeling like an unappreciated genius next to his down-to-earth older brother, did not remain in debt. And you? You're a successful manager. Why didn't you calculate the risks, strategist? Or did you think she would just keep wiping your snot silently? It's all your fault. You always agreed with father, encouraged all his idiotic ventures, just so he would pat you on the head. If he had invested the money in my project then, instead of in his firewood, we would be millionaires now. Their screams must have echoed throughout the apartment, reflecting off the bare walls of their future. They blamed each other, recalling all the old grievances, all the childhood quarrels, all the adult failures. Father Arthur was probably sitting in his armchair, listening to them. The man who had always been the center of their universe, their idol, their tyrant, had suddenly become an empty space. He was no longer a source of money or power. He was just a burden, the embodiment of the very debts that now hung on his sons. But the most powerful blow to their shaky world was delivered by Amelia, Julian's wife. She was a practical woman. She had married for prospects, for status, for an apartment in the center and a vineyard in the country. She had tolerated her father-in-law with his quirks and her mother-in-law with her outdated views for the sake of future well-being. When the well-being evaporated, the reason to tolerate disappeared. She didn't make a scene. She just waited until Julian once again left the house, slamming the door after a fight with his brother, and silently packed her things. 2 large suitcases. When Julian returned in the evening, an empty apartment and a short note on the kitchen table were waiting for him. "I'm filing for divorce. You can keep your parents' apartment. I don't need it." Julian was left alone. With a brother he hated, with a father who had become an unbearable burden for him, and with debts that had to be paid somehow. Arthur was left in the apartment completely alone. His sons, busy with mutual reproaches and attempts to save the remnants of their own lives, stopped paying attention to him. He wandered through the rooms that were once his kingdom and had now turned into a waiting room before eviction. His health, already undermined, finally gave out. Stress, humiliation, the realization of his own collapse and the betrayal of his children. All of this was finishing him off more surely than any cholesterol. One evening, my new, simple flip phone, whose number only Sophie and the lawyer knew, vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I didn't answer. A minute later, a notification of a voice message came. I was alone in the room. Sophie hadn't returned from the university yet. I pressed the play button. Arthur's voice. But it was not the powerful booming bass I knew. It was a cry. A whining, pathetic, senile cry. "Catherine, Katie," he began, sobbing. "It's me, Arthur. I don't know what to do. They abandoned me. Julian doesn't talk to me. Miles has gone somewhere. I'm alone in this apartment. Catherine, forgive me. I was a fool. They taught me. They set it all up." His voice strengthened for a moment. The familiar accusatory notes appeared in it. "And you, why did you do this to us? We're a family. You destroyed everything. Everything we built. Couldn't you just talk? Just forgive." And again he broke into a cry. "Katie, please come back. I'm not well. My heart hurts. I'll die here alone. You don't want that, do you? Please." The message ended. I sat in silence, holding the phone in my hand, and something stirred in my chest. Not love. No, love had died long ago. But something else. A ghost. A ghost of habit, a ghost of duty, a ghost of those 50 years that were impossible to erase. For 50 years I had gotten up at night when he was unwell. For 50 years I had given him his medicine, measured his blood pressure, cooked him dietary soups that he ate with curses. It was so deep in me, this role of a nurse, a savior, that for a moment I felt a pang of pity. A sharp, almost physical pity for this broken, lonely old man. My hand itself reached for the call button. To call. To say that I would call an ambulance. To say that he was not alone. And then I stopped. I looked at my hand, the one that no longer had a ring. I remembered his face, contorted with rage. The applause of my sons. Their cold, calculated plan. And this pathetic cry on the phone ceased to be a cry for help. It became the last, most desperate manipulation. He was again, for the last time, trying to make me responsible for his life, for his mistakes, for his pain. I slowly, very slowly, brought my finger to the screen. Inside me, the past Catherine and the present Catherine were still fighting. Habit and freedom. Pity and dignity. With a firm, calm movement, I pressed the delete button. The message disappeared. The voice fell silent. This is not my burden. Not anymore. The silence that followed the deletion of the message was deafening. It was not emptiness, it was space. Space for my own life, which I had to start anew. A few months passed. The autumn leaves fell, the first snow fell and melted. And then came spring, and after it, the timid but persistent beginning of summer. The world around me had changed, and I had changed with it. I sold the city apartment quickly and without regret. The buyers, a young couple, were happy. They saw their future in it, their hopes. I didn't tell them about the past that these walls held. Why? Every house should have its own story. Now this house would have a new one. I put part of the proceeds into an account, my own separate one, opened in Sophie's name. For her studies, for her future, for her freedom. The rest of the funds went into my personal account, guaranteeing me a peaceful and dignified old age. The divorce was finalized quietly, almost imperceptibly. Just another paper, another signature. Without tears, without scandals, as a statement of a fact that had happened long ago. And today, on the first truly warm June day, I am at my vineyard. Mine. This word still sounded unusual in my head, but with each day, it became more and more natural. The air was clean, transparent, filled with the smell of pine needles, of the damp earth after a recent rain, and of blooming apple trees. I stood in the middle of the garden, my garden. The first thing I did when I arrived here was to go to the overgrown corner by the fence. There, for as long as I can remember, wild roses had been rampant. Thorny, aggressive, they choked everything that tried to grow nearby. Arthur had always promised to uproot them. "Next weekend, Mom, I'll definitely get to it," he would say, settling into a hammock with a newspaper. That next weekend had never come in 20 years. I took a pruner and a spade. Sophie was next to me. We worked in silence, the two of us. First, we cut the thorny branches, then we started on the roots. They went deep into the ground, tenacious, stubborn, unwilling to give up. It was hard work. We pulled them out, shook off the clumps of rich black earth, and piled them up. A few hours later, the corner of the garden was clean. The earth was breathing. It was ready to accept something new. Next to me were buckets with rose seedlings. Pale pink, cream burgundy. I knelt down, scooped up a handful of warm, loose earth. It smelled of life. I began to dig holes. For each rose its own, not too deep, not too shallow, so that the roots would be free, so that they could grow and strengthen. My phone lying on the bench rang. I reluctantly wiped my hands on an old apron and picked it up. An urban number, unfamiliar. "Hello," I said. "Hello, is this Catherine Chandler?" The voice on the other end was female, businesslike, a little tired. "Yes, this is she. My name is Maria. I am a social worker from the city administration. I am calling you about your husband, Arthur Chandler." I froze, clutching the phone. "I'm listening." "Mr. Chandler was hospitalized today, and then transferred to our state gerontology center for permanent residence. His health condition requires round-the-clock supervision, which his sons are unable to provide." She paused, waiting for my reaction. I was silent. "Catherine, there are some documents missing from his personal belongings. As his next of kin, could you answer a few questions for his file?" Next of kin. Those words sounded like an echo from another life. I looked at the cleared patch of land, at the rose seedlings waiting their turn, at the blue, boundless sky overhead. My voice was calm and clear, the voice of a person who is simply making a correction to a document. "I'm sorry, you've made a mistake. I am no longer his next of kin." "What do you mean?" There was genuine bewilderment in the woman's voice. "We are divorced," I explained simply. "You need to contact his sons, Julian or Miles Chandler. All questions concerning their father are now their responsibility." "Oh yes, all right. I'm sorry to have bothered you. Goodbye." "Goodbye." I pressed the end call button, put the phone back on the bench, and took a deep, very deep breath. The air filled my lungs to the very bottom. It was sweet and clean. I felt the last, thinnest thread connecting me to the past finally and irrevocably break. I knelt down again and took the first seedling. I carefully straightened its delicate roots and placed it in the prepared hole. I covered it with earth, gently tamping it down around the thin stem. I looked at my hands. They were covered in dirt, scratched from the thorns, but these were the hands that were creating a new life. I looked at my garden, at the old apple trees, at the beds waiting for their turn, at the clean, free space where roses would soon bloom. And for the first time in many, many years I smiled. Not politely, not restrainedly, not with my last strength. It was a real, quiet, boundless smile. The smile of a woman who had reclaimed herself. And in that silence, under that clear sky, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The sound of my freedom. Thank you for being with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you, please give it a like and write in the comments what feelings it evoked in you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Take care of yourself, be healthy, and live truly.